All right. Well, so first of all, I'd like to talk about this idea about what is a fair value or a fair or equitable lease. So, the running joke among economists is that, a fair is a place where you go to ride the Ferris wheel and eat cotton candy and, watch the livestock judging contest, that kind of thing. So, because really the ideas of fair and equitable involve concepts beyond just looking at a dollar amount. There's other things that go into that. So, really, as long as the tenant and landlord are happy with the decision, they both feel comfortable with it, neither one is being forced into a decision, that's really what we consider to be a fair or equitable lease. Now, that doesn't mean when you come to that price that that's going to be what the county average is, or maybe above or below that. So it could go either way. There's other factors that determine fair, just besides the fact that what the price you have. I know in my particular situation back in my family farm back in Illinois, we have our cousin farming our family farm, and we're actually cutting him a pretty good break on rent just because he had to deal with a lot of things when my dad was still living for the last few years. He was a very demanding landlord. Yeah, he would demand my cousin kind of do a lot of things that I thought was going beyond where he should have gone. So because of that, because he put up with a lot, we're willing to cut my cousin a kind of a break on the rent, and plus he has to put it with me and my brothers who don't always agree about what the rental rate should be or anything anyway. So we've been getting him a good deal. So again, this idea of fair and equitable, as long as both parties are happy with it, that can be any price you agree to, as long as you're happy. Well, that we consider that to be a fair lease. Well, what actually determines a cash rental rate? Well, it really comes down to supply and demand. So you get the more farmers in a county who are looking for land to rent, that's going to tend to drive up price. The same way on the demand side, there's not very much ground for rent, and relative to the amount of farmers, that's going to help drive up price as well here. So that's really the main criteria that goes into that. But certainly net returns and variability of returns are really the big driving factors of actually supply and demand. So whenever net farm income goes up, we would expect to see demand goes up because farmers realize that they can make more money by having more ground to farm with higher prices and higher net farm income. So that's going to lead to an increase in the demand. So again, we're looking at that as we determine really what could be the county cash rental rate in a particular county. Certainly, there's other factors, as I mentioned, besides just the price. Farm location can have a big effect. Whether something is close to your own farm that you're currently farming. I think most farmers would agree that they'd be willing to put a premium on rented land that's relatively close to their home base, rather than having to drive so far. Whether it's actually on a major highway that you can get equipment to back and forth easily is going to be another factor. The field size and shape is going to be a factor. Certainly, there's probably going to be a premium for bigger field sizes that don't have any obstacles to farm around, that are kind of rectangular in shape and that lay nice. Those are going to command a premium. Land quality, that's certainly going to drive the net returns. But again, there's other factors in land quality that may not always be covered by the price that you're negotiating either. Distance to market or storage, how are you going to get those crops out, and what are you going to do with them when you do harvest them? Certainly closer to your co-op or elevator or on-farm storage is going to make a decision there. And again, as I mentioned, the relationship between landlord and tenant. I think most landlords tend to cut long-term tenants a little bit of break just because they are comfortable with them. If you would turn around and maybe try to go for a higher price with a different tenant, you have that idea that you may not really understand and appreciate how they farm, even though you may get a higher price. So certainly good relationships are worth maybe some discount in price in some situations. Cash rents do change based on net farm income, based on looking at some of our data for this. So what I have here is a graph of the state NASS survey cash rents per acre, and you can see it kind of follows a slow trend line. It doesn't really go up or down very dramatically. But contrast that with what our KFMA, our KFBM net farm income per acre is. You see a lot more variability there. But even so, there is still some correlation looking at these two together here. So currently looking at on the U.S. situation, there's an R-square of about 43%. Now, Kansas is not near as high. It's only about 20%. But there is some good evidence that net farm income per acre helps to drive what our net cash rent is going to be. And really the historical perspective of what happened with net farm income is a good guide for what's going to happen with cash rent. Now, you would think in a truly, from an economic sense, that we should look at our net farm income for the coming year, and then whatever, after we cover all expenses, that's what we can afford to pay for the coming year. But we have to really use past data as a guide for what current net farm income is going to be. And in fact, if you look at some of the data from the U.S., a one period lag in the net farm income to what the current cash rent is gives us an R-square of 50%. But actually, then when you combine the previous year and also the year before that, you actually get an R-square of 60%. So there's probably, gets this idea of the fact that we're probably looking at some consistency in net farm income as well when farmers make these rental decisions about how much they're willing to pay here. So probably looking at a past history of net farm income is probably an appropriate technique for looking at what the current cash rental rate should be. Factors to consider for estimating cash rental rate. This is important for practically every farmer in the U.S. because nearly every farm leases some land. In fact, if you look at this graph here, this is basically from our KFMA data, looking at the three major regions in the state, East, West, and Central. You can see the green line is the percent of farms who don't rent any ground at all, meaning that all the ground they farm is their own land. And you can see that's a very, very small percent. And in fact, I would say in all three of the regions across the state, it's probably under 10%. So almost every farmer is renting some ground. And when they do rent ground, it's quite a big percent of the total portfolio of land that they're farming. You can see that, like here in eastern Kansas, you can see that the typical farm, they rent about 75% of the ground that they actually farm. It's actually a little bit higher in central, about the same in west. So again, most farmers do rent, and when they do rent, they a good chunk of the land actually comes from this rented ground. One thing to keep in mind, though, rental rates may not reflect the ability of the land to support market rental rates. As we talked about in the fair concepts, there's other factors that go into that here. And certainly in any given year, the return could be a lot higher, it could be a lot lower. This really depends on what the net income was for that particular year. So there are several sources that we can look at looking at rental rates. Probably the one that most farmers are familiar with is the NASS survey that comes out in August. They do a survey, it's probably over by about now, but they survey folks in the winter, early spring about what the county rental rates are, and they publish those come the end of August here. There's some issues with that, though, because by the time you get it, it may be a bit outdated from when the survey is reported. I always question then about how accurate farmers are being in their response to this. I hate to say farmers are dishonest. I don't think they are. But, there is some incentive there not to maybe to lowball your actual answer, maybe to respond with a rental rate that you negotiated maybe several years ago in those surveys. Mainly because, farmers, I think, look at that as the idea that, well, if this information gets out and my landlord sees that the rate is higher than what they're currently paying, there may be some incentive for them to try to negotiate a higher lease here. So I always question whether farmers are maybe lowballing this a bit. And as I mentioned, the fact that you are asking this as a survey, not every survey is going to take into account the fact that you just looked at the last year. There could be other leases that go into play. There could be multiple year leases that you're currently paying on. So there's other factors that go into that just than what the current rental rate might be. There's some historical information showing up in those surveys. And then again, because this is kind of based on supply and demand, there's not necessarily a direct tie-in between land productivity in these surveys when they collect those. Well, why does every farm need to actually rent farmland? My first response is that farmland will never cash flow. Now, I talked about this last year with our ag lenders in Kansas, and I got a response back that, well, there was a time that they noticed in certain years where there has been situations like that. My response back to that situation would be that if you ever find ground that can cash flow, jump on that right away, because that's going to be a great deal to buy, because in most cases, I would say 99% or above, you're never going to find farmland that will cash flow. And there's two reasons behind that. One is land is not depreciable. Unlike every other asset that a farmer or business would have, land is never going to go down in value. So you can't depreciate out to get the cash flow back from that. The other issue is that when you do look at total returns to a farm, really about half the net returns occur as land appreciation. That's why you always hear the expression tossed around that, farmers are cash poor, but they die rich. Well, this is because land appreciation. You're not seeing cash change hands when your land goes up in value. It increases your equity in your farm, but there's really no cash changing hands during those kind of land depreciation things. So these are the two main reasons why farmland is not going to cash flow. So because it's not cash flowing, then it's not going to cover your principal and interest payments. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing to buy, because we do have this land appreciation going on. Just don't expect that you're going to be able to make the payments on that ground. So to do that, really, if you're going to buy more ground, really you need to have a supply of rented land to kind of cover those cash flow needs, which is why you see most farms probably have about 80% of their land rented, because they are trying to support the land that they have purchased by generating enough cash flow through the rented side of things. Well, as I mentioned, Dan and I put out 2 publications. So what really is the purpose of these publications? I think the idea, our main idea, and I talked about Dan with that this morning, is to get an idea of where rental rates could be going, and maybe where they actually could be based on what the net farm income that we're actually seeing. It's certainly not an endorsement for what the tenant should actually pay a landlord. So you should never look at that one main number that we have and look at that as saying, well, this is what the cash rental rate should be. Always look at these rental rates that we provide as a starting point in the lease negotiations. We both think that you get the best leases when both the tenant and landlord have full information about what's going on in a given county as far as profitability. And you can use this as a starting point. So you may go up from what we just have as a starting point, or you may go down from that. And again, there's other factors to consider just besides the monetary value. The other thing to keep in mind here too is, just like in the Lake Wobegon, not every farm is going to be in the county is going to be an average farm. There are going to be some counties or farms that are above the county average, some are below based on their productivity and soil types. Certainly in Kansas, there's a lot of variability across soil productivity in most counties here. The other thing I think that we do that is really nice, and it has certainly saved Dan and I a lot of headaches, is we provide a range of values rather than just a single point estimate. That covers basically from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, meaning that at the 25th percentile, probably there's still 25% of the farms that probably couldn't cover that rental payment, whereas 75% could. And at the top end, at that point, there's probably only 25% of the farms that could afford a point higher than that here. So anything within that 25th to 75th percentile would probably be a realistic range for probably the majority of the farms in the state within a specific county. So what we're doing for our approach for looking at this rental rate is we're looking at this from a tenant's residual method, meaning that we're looking at cover all the expenses, the direct cost of production. We're looking at covering all the fixed cost. And then we're also looking at covering things like unpaid operator labor and a return to management fees and some overhead costs in there here. So once you cover all those costs, which should be pretty much everything, what you have left over is enough to cover or to contribute to cash rental expenses on rented ground here. And again, we're using the tenant's residual method, which means that we're not only looking at past history, but we're also looking at the current year. And then we're also maybe looking forward a little bit too for some of the future years, but we're looking at the county yield history when we come up with the current year prediction. We're looking at current grain prices situation, and then we're also looking at the KFMA farm expenses as a way to develop an expense at the county level. But really what we're doing is we're developing expenses at the crop reporting district and then translating that back to the farm level here. So again, what we're trying to cover all economic cost in our approach here. So as far as looking at the income side, we're looking at yields, prices, and government payments to go into that. We're looking at county yields. It was possible to look at the NASH yields for looking at the county yields, but they no longer provide separate irrigated and non-irrigated yields. We're having to look at FSA data to do that. We're basically looking at the last 5 years of data to kind of get a weighted average. And then we're also kind of doing the same thing with prices as we look at those as both on the expense side and for the crop prices too. On the expense side, we're looking at KFMA data. We look at this at the enterprise level for our farm, but then we have to account for the different crop mixes as they might change in the coming year. in our estimation of enterprise level, we're only really considering 4 major crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, and grain sorghum, which really covers most of the crop acres in the state here. And that's what we have good KFMA data for. As I mentioned, we developed this at the farm level, but then we have to aggregate it back up to the crop reporting district. So you'll see some differences in graphs, especially along the boundaries of the crop reporting district. That's just kind of an artifact of the model that we're using. Some other details that we're including. So we're including 75% of unpaid labor, which is what KFMA keeps track of. With this 25% that we're not accounting for, that's accounting for farm activities not related to crop production. We're including a 2% management fee based on gross revenue. So this would kind of cover our management fees and the equity charge on owned machinery. And then here's the estimates here. So for the 2023 estimates of net farm income, we actually assigned a 30% weight for the 2022 numbers, even though we didn't have those yet. So this is what we kind of had to estimate to get this into our model, with the realization that farmers probably already had a pretty good idea of what their net farm income was for their farm, but we had to kind of estimate that to include it in our model. And then we have kind of decreasing weights as we go past here. So basically we have a 5-year kind of weighted average with more weight on the most recent years. So when we kind of apply that weighting factors, you can see what we have. So this is the original graph that I have. Here's our cash rent in kind of reddish color here. The blue was yearly net farm income. You can see how much variation there is. But then when I roll this over and use this 5-year weighted average, you see I get quite a bit of smoothing involved, which really helps things out. But there's still, this still doesn't match up exactly with what the reported cash rental rates are. But it does help improve our R square. So we went from basically a 25% R square if I just use these yearly variations versus looking at this 5-year weighted average. It improves my model quite a bit here. So, but even so, with 41, that's still not the greatest R squared value. So that's one of the reasons why we tied our residual approach, looking at the residual net farm income, back into looking at averaging that back in with the survey response, just to kind of give us an idea of where we think cash rental rates may be going in the future. Some other details. So we're going to make adjustments to the NASS reported cash rent. That really helps us smooth our estimate. It really eliminates a lot of our questions, because before we were doing that, you really saw some dramatic year-to-year changes by doing it that way. But by averaging it back in, we really help to get a lot of smoothing. We don't see dramatic changes from year to year. So I think it's a better guide for where cash rental rates may be going. Then we also have to allow for a land use intensity. That's important in a state like Kansas, where we have both double cropping and we also have fallow situations in place. And as I mentioned earlier, we give this range of values from the 25th to the 75th percentile. Some other factors affecting future net farm income and potentially where we think rents may be going. Well, if you look at our net farm income, we really had a period of about 7 years where we had increasing net farm income, basically starting from 2015, which was kind of our low point for net farm income in the state. And then we had increasing net farm income for every year until we got to 2021. That's where we kind of peaked. This is actually based on just the grain farms that I have data for, so it's a little bit higher than what the KFMA reported. But based on the set of farms that I used to estimate net farm income in the state, we really peaked out last year in 2021 with $355,000 of net farm income. Quite a dramatic increase over what it was over in the previous years, and really well above what the historical average was. So this is really an 86% increase over what it was in 2020 here. It's going to take a long time before we ever get back to this level of net farm income again. My current estimate for the data that the KFMA folks are currently compiling that we just completed in December is we're going to show about a 56% drop in net farm income over what it was. So even though this is a huge drop over what it was, it's lower than certainly 2021 and even 2020. It's still above what it was probably if you look at a 10-year history of net farm income. So this is still a pretty good net farm income. The problem is going even further forward for this year. And again, it's very, very risky to make it a prediction at this point in time, because we don't have anything on the ground except for wheat that's growing right now, and you'd argue whether it's even growing right now in some parts of the state here, but. Even assuming normal yields, I think we're looking at probably a big drop off in net farm income, really because of the higher expenses you're going to see. So again, this would be a 74% drop over where we were before here. So again, still profitable year probably, but again, certainly not what farmers have been used to in the recent past. And just to give you an idea why I think weather could be a big factor in the lower net farm income this year. This is actually what I call, this is a Likert graph based on the drought monitor numbers here. So if you look at the drought monitors, they have 6 levels of, if you count the none, 6 levels of drought situation for the state. And you guys all know, looking at those graph monitor graphs, there's a lot of red in southwest Kansas, which is the D4 level here. Just looking at this is centered on the D1 level here in the middle. And that's what that number here represents, the percent of D1. And everything D2, D3, and D4 are represented over here. And then D0 and none are the numbers you see over here. So just eyeballing this, you can see that 2023 is certainly not starting the year very well based on the end of February. Probably only 1 year out of the last 25 actually been worse at this time of the year, which was 2013, which is really that was a super bad year going into the growing year. But this year is certainly not shaping out to be very well. I've already done an initial projection for wheat, again, even though it's very, very early to try to do that kind of thing. But my current projection for wheat is about 36 bushel per acre. This would be well below the current average for what wheat yield should be for the state here. So not a great start. It's probably way too early to say what corn, soybeans are going to be, because we could still turn around and see some rains here. So I don't want to estimate that yet. But my current projection is that wheat is not going to be it's going to struggle to get to be an average year for wheat. Let's put it that way. And on the expense side, this is probably going to be the most expensive year I think farmers have ever had for producing a crop, which is certainly going to hold back net farm income. If you look at how expenses have changed over the last year and a half, here's our CPI index, which is currently running about 8%. Maybe it's starting to go down a little bit now. But look at all these expense categories. Nearly every single one of these is higher than what the inflation rate has been over the last 18 months. You've probably all heard that fertilizer, was really, really bad. And, about a year ago, that certainly was the situation. But fertilizer has since backed off a little bit. Now look at what is our most expensive category of expenses over the last 18 months. That's herbicides. They're almost up well over 40% over the last year and a half. So that's going to be a big hit to farmers, because that is one of their major input categories. And then even relative to a 3-year perspective, things don't look too good either here. So a lot of expenses going up way, way higher than the inflation rate, which means that even though grain prices may be looking fairly well, the fact that we have to pay much higher expenses are going to hold back our ability to make money and pay cash rents. Well, how are farmers doing looking at their balance sheets? Well, if you just look at the debt to asset ratio, you think we're doing really, really well, except for maybe the western side of the state. But this is kind of maybe like a false flag situation. The reason our debt to asset ratios are so low is because land values have been going up. We have actually been adding debt per crop acre at a pretty good rate, really, since about the year 2000 or so. You can see what the situation is in the west central and east. Maybe here in the center, we've kind of leveled off here, but there's still pretty high debt levels on a crop acre basis here. If you just look at the balance sheet, over here we have our equity, which is really that big increase you're seeing there is higher land values, but we have added debt here. So that's not a good situation in a year where we may be going into possibly higher interest rates with the ability to pay more cash rent numbers. Well, here's our what the cash rent numbers look like on a county level basis. Again, these are in our Ag Manager publication, so I would encourage you all to look at those to see where we are. This is what NASS has in their numbers. You notice they don't have very, very dramatic changes between the counties, which I think makes farmers fairly happy, because they can kind of look at the neighboring county to see how theirs are doing. If you look at our results, you'll see that we probably have more variation in the county numbers than what the NASS has. And this is probably why I get more phone calls from this from anything else, because farmers will look at this and see what the rate is in one county and then wonder why theirs is higher. Well, it has to go back to how we estimated those crop expenses and revenue for the counties. And I think really some of it has to go back, and when you go back and look at the amount of corn acres have really been kind of a driving force as far as profitability, because corn has started to pay off, at least until the most recent couple of years anyway. much higher than what wheat has. So notice here, the counties in Kansas, and this is non-irrigated corn acres, where we actually grow the most corn in Kansas, the dryland corn, is actually over here in Thomas County. This is our biggest non-irrigated corn county in the state. Certainly you don't think of this part of the state as being a big corn area, and certainly it doesn't compare to what the Corn Belt looks like when you drive through the county. But they grow corn with a lot less population, but it's still a fairly profitable crop, which I think has actually helped them be able to pay higher cash rents. And in fact, if you look at this on a percent basis, you'll notice Thomas County I guess this would be 2001, had about over half their crop acres were in corn acres, contrasted to some of the other counties where they hardly grew any corn down here in more south central Kansas. Here's what our publication looks like with both the last year's numbers, the current year's numbers, and then this 2022 is what came out in August from NASS. And then here's our number that we published in September for the coming year here. So this is kind of our midpoint number, but again, don't get hung up on this particular number here. Certainly look at the range that goes along with that from as a place where the rent could fall, and just use these numbers kind of as starting points going forward. Again, all this stuff is in our Ag Manager publications. Just looking at crop reporting districts, when you kind of average together, no surprise that our northeast part of the counties, our state has the highest cash rent, and certainly NASS would agree with that because of the better soils and more rainfall. But as you can see here, we're probably higher than what NASS numbers are showing, which would probably be an indication that NASS is probably a little behind of what we're having here. So I would really expect when you see the publication come out from NASS in August, you're probably going to see a jump in the cash rental rate numbers again, even though profitability may be trending down. Again, there's probably a little bit of delay going here. So I would really look at cash rent numbers going up for sure this current year, and probably even maybe going up a little bit in the following year before you start to see some of those NASS numbers trend back down. Looking at the irrigation side, so we're able to provide a lot more irrigation numbers than what NASS shows. Just looking at here's what the numbers NASS provides for these counties. We're able to fill in some of these details because we do know the number of rented acres within a county here. So by using our procedure to estimate expenses, I can go back and actually come up with a cash rental rate for irrigated ground for these counties that NASS is missing here. But keep in mind, we're assuming the landlord owns all the irrigation equipment here. If that's not the case, you should go back and look at these numbers from our irrigation budgets to make allowances here. So, if the tenant actually is providing the tenant pivot, then you can basically take $70 off per acre for that cost to account for those kind of things. So just keep that in mind when you look at those rented numbers. And again, our publication of the irrigated numbers look similar to that. All right, Dan, I'll turn it over to you and let you talk about the situation in Nebraska, because it has some influence, I would think, over what is happening in northern Kansas counties.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. One good reason to bring up the Nebraska surveys, because it gives kind of a midpoint in terms of data on not just the levels of cash rents, but also the percent changes from the previous year. So this set of numbers just came out, just reported March 15th, so it's pretty recent. And really for us, if you hit return, Gregg, advance, I guess, there you go. For us, I think we're looking at what's happening in the southern part of that of the state of Nebraska. Again, southwest, southeast would be of relevance to us. And note this survey comes from a little different source. It's a UNL Farm Real Estate Market Development Survey. They do this annually. There's a 22 one. There's the one earlier this year of 23, and they ask a little bit of a different audience. Again, survey of Nebraska land industry professionals. So they're talking to appraisers, farm and ranch managers, ag bankers, and others. The Kansas survey is more of a farmer, and there's local landowners involved in that too. But it's a little bit of a different source of information, a little different perspective on the market. And that survey is available from at the website that you see there. Advance. So let's take a look at this. And they state on the Nebraska survey, and I've spoke to their folks about their information. Their final comprehensive survey is released, I think, in June or July. So this is the first cut that's out. We have average 2023 rent and the percent annual change, and then the high-low for high-low 1/3 for land quality return. So let's take a look first at the dry land non-irrigated cash rents for 2023. So we'll put these numbers up, and then I'll talk the major caveat in looking at these Nebraska numbers, and that has to do with property taxes return. So here in return once more, Greg. There you go. So again, we're really focusing on any help we can get on dry land cash rents on this slide for 2023 and the change from 22. Now, you can see the averages that we have there, Greg. I was looking at some of the averages across for the counties that we have that you were projecting. Some of those averages, particularly in Southwest Nebraska, as they border some of our Northwest, borderline North Central counties in Kansas, not too far off. They're up there with the audience they surveyed. They were talking about a 13% increase in cash rent in Nebraska. Now, this is probably the time to mention their property taxes. In looking at their crop budgets, they're showing property taxes on non-irrigated cropland. It basically is 1.4% of the value of the land. In that's the market value of the land, appraised market value. And then we in Kansas, we use a land use value procedure based out of what Lease in our shop at Kansas State University is involved in that, but it's a land use valuation percentage, a rolling average of X number of years. So in talking with people at the Department of Revenue, pretty vast difference between the property taxes in Nebraska and that in Kansas. And the UNL budgets, they're projecting about $54.60 an acre for non-irrigated property taxes. For irrigated property taxes, 105 or 108, depending which part of the state you're in. So interesting to look at. So again, looking at those Southwest numbers, they have a high third, $74 an acre, a low third of 45. I found anyway, and looking at over time, a fair number of our irrigated cash, our NAS numbers aren't too far off of that low third quality. So you're seeing some adjustment for that in the what they call the south part of Nebraska, match up fairly decently with our north central. And you can see the average cash rent of $115 an acre, a percent change of 15%, strong increases in Nebraska. You can see the range there based on quality. And then southeast, you're up in Nebraska, my old native state. You're looking at some pretty strong counties up in that area. But their average cash rent, pretty strong counties, crop production wise, $200. Southeast Nebraska, a 5% increase. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at irrigated cash rents and advance one, Greg. You're looking at this, just as you'd mentioned, Greg, we struggle the most to get good complementary data to compare to on the irrigated side, and advance one more time. Yeah, advance again. There, right. So these numbers have the property tax issue in there, and they're out in the market. So if they come up, we need to be able to understand what they're saying. They assume that these people that they're surveying, they're giving numbers that include the center pivot value in the land. So they're assuming that the cash rents on center pivot land assumes that the landowners own the center pivot system. So, and we'd seen earlier what Gregg had talked about, $70 an acre for a center pivot. That's for a brand new pivot. If there's a used pivot, it might be, you just take that down to 70% of that, something along those lines, but might be some adjustment lower. But assuming in Southwest Kansas, Southwest Nebraska, that the landowner owns the pivot, that's the average rent $230 an acre, the high third 275, 190 for the low third quality. And then in the South, 315, 13% increase, 2% increase out in Southwest, a 6% increase in the Southeast. And you can see the average numbers and the low ends there. So, we look at those numbers and they're not low numbers, but again, they include center pivot ownership, and by our stretch, that's $70 an acre, and higher property taxes as well. Next, pasture rents, advanced one time. Southwest, I don't know that we vary much in Southwest, in Kansas, on pasture rent as we do on the irrigated and dry land. But you can see, maybe the thing that's important there is the percent changes. They are showing some positive percent changes, 6% upwards in Southwest, 2% in Southeast, 5%. And again, a lot of our rents probably aren't far off of the NAS rents being showed, may not be far off of the low third quality there. So kind of an implicit property tax adjustment probably going on there. Show you one more. I think we don't often use the Nebraska survey much, but if we're looking at cow-calf pair monthly rental rates and having something to compare against the Flint Hills survey that we have in Kansas, there's something here to work with. Again, you can see the numbers there. Not a lot of variation. There is a little bit of increase, and high third quality, low third quality, advanced one. And you see their assumptions on cow-calf pairs, typically considered to be 1.1 1/4, 1.3 animal units, with the definition they have there of animal unit being 1,000-pound animal for a 5-month grazing season. But again, there can be adjustments by cow weight and age of calf. So I don't know that we typically use this very much, but if you're looking for a source on renting cow-calf pairs, I'd like to compare that to the Flint Hills survey that comes out. There seems to be something of value here. Advance. There we go. Well, I wanted to show those Nebraska numbers. They are out in the market. They're I guess they're recent. If they do come up in discussions, you can look at the property tax differentials, and there are some that are substantial. And on the irrigated side, to be sure that people understand that there's center pivot ownership by the landowner dialed right into those numbers. Gregg, turn it back to you.
Okay, well, I'm not sure I can read the chat very well, but and you were supposed to be running questions for me.
Oh, yes. I've been looking at that. We haven't had, actually, the biggest questions came in was definition of R squared from our earlier discussions, but I think we've got that one nailed down. Okay. So others haven't come in yet.
Oops.
Dan, you have one regarding the pasture rental slides.
Okay. From James Louder, I have a question about the pasture rental slides. It seems to be that the rate per acre is almost the same as the rate for cow-calf pair. How can this be? On the let's go. Well, I think we pulled off of that. We've taken that down. I think that the pasture rental rates they've been running 20, 30 or so. I think the cow-calf pair numbers were 40, 50, 60. I didn't show them slowly, James, to talk through and compare them side by side. But I think the pasture rents for the season are 25, 30, $35. But I think that the monthly rates per cow-calf pair, well, it's probably per unit rate. Is that on a per unit? I think you've got comparisons on a per unit rate as opposed to per acre rate. Per acre for the season, per unit over the 5 months, and the difference lies in that, I think. There's a question from Lisa Shem. Just to clarify, do the dry land rental rates include fallow ground? Yes, they do. And that it's not just the crop ground. And in fact, that's Lisa, where we have in Western Kansas, 2 crop in 3 years. We have every incentive for people. There's an economic incentive to try to minimize fallow, just because when we rent land, we're paying for land to sit fallow for the next year. And so we try to minimize fallow because some would view that as non-productive land. They're kind of discounting the moisture that's taken in during that time. So yes, out in Western Kansas, when the rental rate, when we're paying a dry land cash rental rate, it includes the fallow ground.
Then I should point out too that from our KFMA data, I have the ability to see on a farm how much of their ground is fallow in their farm mix. So yeah, that is fully incorporated into the calculation. The same with double cropping too. I account for that in those counties that I'm not sure how many counties actually have double cropping here in Kansas, but a few, I think. So that's incorporated too.
There is the comment about land can go down in value. Gregg made mention of land that does not depreciate perhaps, but it can and has devalued in years past. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yes, it can go down in value. That would affect the your equity situation. Again, but it would really have no influence on the cash flow perspective side of things. So
I would say, except in extraordinary circumstances. I remember in the farm crisis years, Gregg, you and I are seasoned enough, we can remember that. When I saw your moving average of rents over time and the variations, things were hopping around in terms of the annual upfront, it reminded me about how during the farm crisis years, we saw cash rents actually stay fairly stable, but the land values crashed. It was a financing issue, finance, having money available to buy land. So we saw cash rents actually be more stable than the value of land. Of course, it recovered and got back onto its long-term growth rate in not too many years. It can appreciate, but it doesn't tend to stay around very long. And it's brought about by extraordinary circumstances. In that case, interest rates and low profitability. I
was going to add that that's a good point, because if we ever get in a situation where lenders are a little reluctant to lend to farmers to buy ground, then that's going to put upward pressure probably on rental rates, because if farmers do want to control ground, that may be their only option if they can't get bank financing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not seeing anything else. Folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. Oops, here came one. I had a question as to what would be the general estimate that dry land increased in percent terms. It is possible to look at that.
The percent increase in dry land. Yes. Well, we can certainly look at what the NAS shows for changes from year to year. That would be easy enough to calculate. But if I had to guess for what the NAS survey is going to show for the cash rental rates for this coming year, that's going to be released in August, I would expect to see. I wouldn't be a bit surprised to see, like we saw in Nebraska, probably in the 10 or 15% increase in those NAS surveys. So.
Except out in the West where they had drought, and that would hold that off some, but where there was some moisture in the eastern 2/3 of the state, perhaps the high side. If you nailed me to the wall, I'd say 5 to 7%. but we don't know. Farmers will vote with their negotiations on that. And as you'd said, Gregg, there's some inertia. We're bringing forth, and in your calculations, we bring forth where we're at, and we make marginal changes off of that. So that'll probably come into play.